ago, almost 11 now, I transitioned over to doing reserve studies. So I've been on both sides of the table, both as a manager and as a reserve study professional. And I actually was even the board president of my HOA for several years. I've worn lots of hats in the industry. So today we'll be chatting about reserve studies, and we'll just get right into it. So we'll start with the introduction about what a reserve study is. We'll talk about the contents of a reserve study, the calculations that we use, and what the percent funded means. I'll have some advice on how to implement your reserve study for your community. And then we'll talk a little bit about building envelope investigations and why those are important to associations, particularly if you're a condominium association with building exteriors that you maintain. So this is a little chuckle for your Wednesday afternoon. For those who may not be looking at a large screen or just listening in on their phone, it's a cartoon. There's a gentleman standing up that says, "Why should I contribute to reserves at my age? I don't even buy green bananas." And it looks like they're at a board meeting here talking about reserve funding for their community. So just a little chuckle today. So here's the definition of a reserve study under National Reserve Study Standards. A reserve study is a budget planning tool that identifies the components a community association is responsible for maintaining or replacing, the status of the reserve fund, and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the anticipated future major common area expenditures. So the two key pieces here are that the reserve study is a budget tool. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And the intent of the study is to do a stable and equitable funding plan, and equitable meaning fair to all owners, not just past owners or future owners, a fair funding plan that benefits all owners over time as people buy and sell their units within the community. So here's a little bit of a comparison of what a reserve study is and what it isn't. So at the end of the day, the reserve study is a budgeting tool only. The reserve study is intended to get the association in the rough ballpark cost and time frame of a project. It funds for predictable projects only, so removal and replacement of a roof, grinding and overlay of asphalt, replacement of a play structure. It includes the existing assets only, so it does not include adding something that doesn't exist. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the site visits are what we call a limited visual review, typically from ground level. So if you're a condominium association and you have steep slope roofs with composition shingle roofing, we're not using ladders and climbing up on those roofs and walking around on those roofs. Typically, we do everything from ground level. The exception would be if you have a building that has what we call a low slope roof or a flat roof, where there's a hatch that we can climb through to view the roof. We will get up there, but we're not doing things like walking on steep slope roofs. And we're also looking at a sampling of the asset. So we're not looking at every single deck, every single square inch of asphalt, or every single square inch of concrete. We're looking at a sampling of the assets as part of those limited visual reviews, just to get the association in the ballpark range for the reserve study. So let's talk about now what the reserve study isn't. It is not a structural engineering, building envelope, or otherwise invasive investigation. We're not taking things apart. We're not looking under the hood. We're not doing moisture test readings, anything like that. It's important to note that even if you are using a reserve study provider that offers structural or engineering services, or the person that's doing the reserve study has those qualifications, the reserve study is only a budget tool, and having anything done in terms of structural evaluation, anything like that, is typically a completely separate scope of work. So even if the reserve study provider offers those services, it's not typically done as part of the reserve study. You would do that as a separate engagement with that firm. The reserve study is not an exact cost or timeline estimate. Our reports forecast forward over a 30-year period. So we're not going to be exact, and we know that, but we're just trying to get the association in the rough time frame and ballpark cost. The reserve study does not forecast unpredictable or unknown projects or costs. So examples of that would be hidden damages. Let's say you take your roofing shingles off and there's mold in the attic or ventilation that needs to be improved in the attic. That would not be forecasted by the reserve study. Sometimes boards will opt to change the scope of work totally and expand something or make something smaller, things like that. So that's just something that can't be predicted by the reserve study. So we're not forecasting what we call unpredictable or unknown things. And then I mentioned it a little bit earlier, the reserve study is not a capital improvement model. If you are adding something that does not exist, so let's say you're putting in a swimming pool when you did not have a swimming pool, that is considered a capital improvement. It typically is limited by your governing documents. It may require an owner vote or something like that for the association to even proceed, but the reserve funds would not be able to be used for that item because it's not an existing asset. However, once you actually install it, then you can add that item to your reserve study for future replacement. One big question that we get is, what if you change the materials? So I had an association that approached me earlier, and they had a different siding material on the building currently, and they want to change that material when they replace it. And they wanted to know if that would be considered a capital improvement because that new material is more expensive than what they had. And the short answer is no. So National Reserve Study Standards does provide for what we call the natural evolution of a project. Siding materials, for example, that were available on the market back in the 60s and 70s are totally different than what's on the market today. So an older building wouldn't maybe want to put on the same material that it has because there's better materials out there. So you certainly can upgrade an item that is existing. You just can't add something that did not exist in the first place. So there are 4 types of reserve studies. The first is the level 1 full reserve study. This is the first reserve study that an association will ever do. That's where the reserve study provider performs a site visit. They're typically going to photograph all of the association's assets, and they're going to create the component list by quantifying all of the assets. So measuring things, counting things, and creating that component list using those component quantities. The level 2 with site visit reserve study is very similar to the level 1 full study in that you're still doing a site visit, you're still typically photographing the assets, but we're not quantifying anything and we're not creating a component list because that was already done under the level 1 full study. So once you complete that level 1 full study, typically that you don't need to do that again in the future. You just update the report either with level 2 site visit reports or level 3 no site visit reports. And that really goes for any reserve study provider you're using. As long as your reserve study includes component quantities, that data is portable. So if you were to change reserve study providers, a new reserve study provider can pull those component quantities forward and not need to repeat that level 1 full reserve study process because you already have your component quantities calculated. So then the third one there, I touched on it briefly, is the level 3 no site visit reserve study. It's self-explanatory, really. There's no site visit performed by the reserve study provider, but all of the financial data in the report is updated. So the starting reserve balance, any projects that have been completed are reset, and then all of the costs in the report are updated to current market rates. The last one is a level 4 preliminary community not yet constructed report. This typically doesn't apply probably to most of us on the call today, although maybe a manager or two might have one. This is where the reserve study is created off of plans and specs because there is nothing constructed for the reserve study provider to view and photograph and quantify. So let's talk a little bit about reserve study governance. Who says we have to do these things and where is that coming from? So the requirement to do a study typically comes from state statute. Oregon does have statutes requiring that. If we have anybody in the room that is in Washington as well, Washington has a statute that requires reserve studies as well. And then your governing documents may also have a requirement to do the reserve study. We often will see governing document language which kind of mirrors the statutory language for reserve studies. So that's typically where we see that requirement. And then the data that goes into a study comes from also state statute, but then National Reserve Study Standards. You've heard me mention that a couple of times thus far in the presentation. National Reserve Study Standards are created by Community Associations Institute, which is a nonprofit institute that mission is to provide education to board members and managers. They also issue our credentials as a professional reserve study provider. And so they prepare the National Reserve Study Standards that reserve studies should be prepared to. Those standards were revised recently. Back in 2023, they were revised in response to the Florida condominium collapse, and just made a little bit more stringent in terms of what a reserve study should include to make sure that we're not omitting things that could potentially lead to a situation like we saw down in Florida. So key reserve study calculations. Your reserve study is going to include a ton of numbers, but I'll touch on kind of two of the most important ones that boards really tend to pay attention to. So the first one is the fully funded balance. Most times people look at the reserve study and they see the fully funded balance number on there, and it's a huge number. Usually it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not into the millions, if you are a large community. And the person reading the reserve study thinks, okay, the fully funded balance is the amount it would cost to replace everything, which kind of makes sense, right? But that's not actually how the reserve study works. The reserve study actually looks at deterioration of the assets, not the total replacement cost. So the fully funded balance is the cumulative amount that the association's assets have deteriorated as of the date of the study. So to use a really simple example, let's say that you are a condo with a parking lot, or you're an HOA with a private road, and you will resurface that asphalt every 30 years, and it will cost $30,000. The association would then save $1,000 a year for 30 years to have enough money in the 30th year to do that project. So if that asphalt is 5 years old, the fully funded balance is not $30,000, the total cost of the asphalt project. The fully funded balance for the asphalt is $5,000 because the asphalt has deteriorated for 5 years at $1,000 a year. So in the 6th year, that fully funded balance goes up by $1,000 because the asphalt's now another year older. So that's what that fully funded balance is that's all of the association's assets combined into one big number, how much they've deteriorated to date. So that fully funded balance goes up every year as the assets age and thus have another year of deterioration. Then it can actually also go down if you complete a major project. So if you're a condominium and you replace your roof, you no longer need to have that money on hand as part of your fully funded balance because the roof is brand new and it has no deterioration to be part of that balance. So the fully funded balance fluctuates as the association ages and then as it completes projects. So when we look at how much money the association has in reserves, and we compare that to the fully funded balance itself, which would be how much you would have if you were to have 100% of the amount the assets have deteriorated to date, we get a percent funded. So we compare those two, we get a percent funded. And here's what that percent funded means. So if your association is 0 to 29% funded, it is considered to be weakly funded, and it has a high risk of a special assessment. If your association is 30 to 69% funded, you're considered fairly funded, and you have a moderate risk of a special assessment. And if your association is 70% or more funded, you are strongly funded and you have the lowest risk of a special assessment. If you're ever curious about where your association may fall, our firm actually tracks statistics for all of our clients for the prior year. We publish those in January. It's just for our clients only. It's certainly not intended to be representative of the industry as a whole. But if you're ever curious, on our website, which is accuratereserves.com, under the FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions tab, you will see the statistics every year, and you can check that out and see where your association might fall in terms of our clientele, if you're just ever curious for a comparison. So let's talk about how well-funded communities compare to poorly funded communities. So again, a well-funded community would be an association that is 70% or more funded. Those communities have the lowest risk of a special assessment compared to a poorly funded community, which has the highest risk. A well-funded community will have little to no deferred maintenance simply because they have the money to keep up on things, versus a poorly funded community that will often defer maintenance simply because they don't have the money to fix something. A well-funded community will select qualified vendors based on quality of work and qualifications. Whereas a poorly funded community often feel pressured to select the least expensive vendor and sometimes will sacrifice quality for price because that's all they can afford. They're trying to avoid a special assessment, so they select the absolute least expensive vendor that they can find, and sometimes that doesn't end up being the least expensive over time. A well-funded community avoids unnecessary repairs because they're able to replace an item if it has sustained significant damage or it's continually needing to be repaired. They'll just have the money to replace it instead. Whereas a poorly funded community will often continually spend money repairing an item that probably should have been replaced. Roofing is a great example of that. We'll see often in poorly funded communities, they don't have the money to replace the roof. So they will spend money repairing the roof over and over and over, even though those repairs are not extending the remaining useful life of the roof. They're just kind of trying to limp it along until they have enough money to replace it. A well-funded community actually saves money. You can do the project in full. You can use a qualified vendor that will do a great job that might actually last longer than a vendor that may not do as good of a job. And you can take advantage of economies of scale. The more work you perform at once, the cheaper the per square foot or the per item price typically is. With poorly funded communities, and we see this all the time, they often phase or partially complete a project. So they will do just one building of paint, or they will replace one wall of one building of siding because they don't have enough money to do the entire building. The problem is when you replace, for example, one wall of a building of siding, in order to get those materials to properly overlap, when you come back to do the other walls you didn't do, you have to partially disassemble what you already did to try to finish the building, thus essentially paying for that portion twice. So plus the fact that if you're not doing all of your association at once, you're not getting the best per square foot price just in general. So poorly funded communities, that's the number one thing we see. They phase or partially do a project. Well-funded communities maximize property values. Buyers are now looking for well-funded communities. We'll talk about that in a moment. Their buildings look great. They're well-maintained. They're typically freshly painted, whereas a poorly funded community risks a decline in property values because maybe the buildings need quite a bit of work, or the reserve study is recommending a special assessment, which can be a red flag to buyers. So the reserve study is going to offer 3 funding plans. 2 of these are required by National Reserve Study standards. That's your 100% full funding plan and your baseline funding plan. And the threshold funding model is typically at the reserve study provider's discretion and is usually at what we refer to as a 70% model, because as you will recall, I mentioned previously that associations that are 70% or more funded have the lowest risk of a special assessment. So with the 100% funding model, the association aims to slowly increase its percent funded to 100% over the next 30 years. So a misconception here is that the 100% full model gets you there really quickly. You're just front loading your reserve account and adding a bunch of unnecessary money. That's not true at all. The 100% model slowly increases the percent funded over time so that within the 30th year of the reserve study, so 30 years from now, the association finally achieves that 100% full funding amount. If you're already starting out as a generally well-funded association, usually 70% or more funded, you might hit 100% earlier than that 30th year, but at the worst case scenario, we get you there within the 30th year. It's a very slow and gradual increase. The 70% model is the exact same premise. You're slowly aiming to grow your percent funded over time. but instead of ending at 100% funded, you're ending at 70% funded. The baseline model is a totally different premise. With the baseline funding model, the association is looking for the absolute minimum it can contribute to reserves and stay above zero over the next 30 years. The baseline model is very risky. Most reserve study providers, our firm included, do not recommend it because it comes with a very high risk of a special assessment. But the reason that it can be risky is at one or more times in the next 30 years, the association will literally deplete all of its reserve funds essentially down to zero. And the risk there is that that usually occurs in a year where you're performing a major project. So if that project goes over budget by even 5 or 10%, which we pretty regularly see occurring, the association may end up having to do a special assessment simply because it won't have enough money to do that project. So a lot of questions come about as to what goes in the reserve study. So we use a 3-part test under National Reserve Study Standards. In order for an item to be funded within the reserve study, it has to meet all 3 of these items, not just one of them. So first of all, it has to be the association's responsibility. It can't be something that's an owner responsibility. It has to be predictable. So it has to be something that we know will occur. So roof replacement's a great example. Windows, asphalt, play equipment, things like that. We do often use rotating allowances for some things that aren't as predictable in terms of complete replacement, but we know will likely incur a reserve expense. So an example there would be landscape refurbishing. Maybe you run a rotating allowance every 5 or 10 years to replace a few dead trees or something like that. And then it has to be significant in cost. We typically define that as equal to 1% or more of the annual operating budget. So if your association has a $100,000 annual operating budget, your reserve funding threshold would be $1,000, which would be 1% of that amount. One last piece that's kind of an honorable mention. It's not officially part of the 3-part test, but it does help, is that the item really should not occur annually if you're going to put it into the reserve study. It just doesn't make sense to put that money into reserves and then take it straight back out in the same year. So if you have an item that you're doing annually, even if it's a major expenditure, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, it makes sense just to include that in your annual operating budget because you're going to pay that annually, just like you pay your landscaper or your insurance or anything else. So let's talk about where the costs in the reserve study come from. So each reserve study provider is going to handle these a little bit differently, but for the most part, they come from about 6 different places. So the first and best place for a cost history is going to be the client's cost history itself, because that cost is specific to the association. It's not based on a general industry estimate. It's very client specific. Next will be estimates or contracts that the client might provide. This could be for either a project that's coming up that hasn't yet been completed, or it could even just be something that you got bids for but decided not to do yet. Still, you want to provide those estimates to your reserve study provider because those estimates are detailed for your community and will help dial in your reserve study for your community specifically. Sometimes we will reach out to client vendors to research things. This is typically done when we have either an anomaly, it's something that we don't typically see, or we're just not confident in the industry average cost, and we want to make sure that we're in the ballpark for your community. So your reserve study provider might ask for some vendor contact information if that's the case. Our firm in particular does research with general industry vendors every single year. So we see kind of the same vendors used by community associations over and over and over again. So we will reach out to them and say, hey, what are you seeing this year for siding replacement? What are you seeing this year for window replacement? So that we know that this is coming from vendors that communities are using and it's within the industry. It's not just some generalized database that we're getting that from. Our firm and many other firms track the cost histories at other clients. So if a client replaces their fence, we will break that down into a lineal foot cost so that we can kind of test that and see what the general industry cost is for that. And then there are nationally available databases. Our firm does not use those. I can't speak for what other firms are doing, but typically a national database is not really going to be accurate, if you will, for our area. Typically, the Pacific Northwest tends to be quite a bit more expensive than other areas of the country. So we really rely on either client costs or costs that we've researched specifically in the local industry. Here's another funny today. So he says, you have 500 for lotto tickets? And he says, yes, it's part of our reserve funding plan. Please don't ever tell me that your association is using lotto tickets to fund its reserves, because we might need to have a conversation about that. Probably not a reliable way of funding. Okay, so let's talk about the traits of a good reserve study. So at a minimum, the reserve study should be prepared by or under the supervision of a credentialed reserve specialist. So that's the RS designation. I mentioned that CAI, Community Associations Institute, is the one that issues that credential. The people who hold that credential will have shown that they are preparing reserve studies in accordance with national standards. They've done a certain number of studies. Their reports meet the national standard. So you want to make sure that they or somebody at their office holds that credential. You want to also make sure that the reserve study meets the statutory requirements. If it's not, that's really a problem, right? The reserve study has to meet the statutory requirements, since the Washington and Oregon both have statutory requirements for studies. I mentioned it needs to meet the National Reserve Study standards. And then the last one here is really important. It needs to include component quantities. So some state statutes require them in the report. Regardless of any statutory requirement, National Reserve Study Standards requires component quantities. As a reserve study provider, I've been doing this for 10 years now. I cannot walk up to a building, look at that roof, and tell you it's a $30,000 roof. But I can tell you how much per square foot it may cost to replace that roof. So in order to do that, I have to have a component quantity. I talked about in the level 1 full study, we derive those component quantities by counting or measuring things. So we have to have those component quantities. If your study does not have those, it is a huge red flag, because there's really no reliable basis to base the study costs off of if you're not able to break it down into a per square foot or a per lineal foot or a per unit cost. Bonus points if your reserve study is easy to read and understand. If the project costs include professional fees for building envelope components. When you are replacing windows, roofs, and siding, it is a best practice to use professional project management, architectural details, to make sure that you're using appropriate materials and that they're being installed correctly to get the longest useful life of that item. The reserve study cost should include the total project costs from start to finish, including those professional fees. Bonus points if the predictable projects are included, regardless of the length of the lifespan. Sometimes you will hear the argument made that only items that have a 30-year or less lifespan should be included in the reserve study. That really does not do the association any good, because the items that might have a longer useful life, let's say siding, which often lasts 50 years or more, if you are omitting that from the reserve study until it reaches a remaining useful life of 30 years or less, you have now shorted yourself a good 20 plus years of saving for that item. And any owners that bought and sold in that period that owned their unit and lived behind that siding did not pay toward reserves for that siding. So really, even if the item has a long lifespan, it should be included in the reserve study. It's a lot less expensive to save up in 1/50th increments for a 50-year item than it is to save up in 1/30th increments for a 50-year item. And then lastly, bonus points if your reserve study notates client project cost histories. By doing that, that becomes a centralized historical document. As board members change, as management companies may change, you have one document with all of your project histories. You're not scrolling through a general ledger or looking through an Excel spreadsheet. You can go straight to that page in the study and see the entire replacement history for the gutters in your association, for an example. The other thing that allows is your reserve study provider can look at your history and track that and adjust the reserve study for your community specifically. So again, if I have a community that's reporting frequent roof repairs, I'm going to notate that on the roofing component. And if they're repairing that roof every year or two, I'm going to say, hey guys, maybe we need to evaluate whether it's time to replace this roof instead of just continually repairing it. Okay. So reviewing your reserve study and implementing it into your budget. So the first thing you're going to want to do is review the study and notify your provider of any revisions. Most reserve study providers often offer, a revision period where you can respond to them with a list of items that you think might need to be adjusted. Some things may not be negotiable. For example, I have had boards that have asked me to take out the siding in the reserve study. They think it's going to last forever. They don't want to fund for it. Unfortunately, we've had to say no. Nope, that's just not reasonable based on what we see in the general industry. And it's our job to give them a reserve study that represents what we see in the industry. So that revision was not negotiable. But other things, a lot of cosmetic things, carpet replacement. If you have a clubhouse, remodeling the kitchen, sometimes associations want to add a line item for beauty bark, something like that. All of those things are absolutely able to be tailored to your community. And then sometimes your revisions may also come because you researched that item with a professional. So maybe you have a letter from your roofer, a letter from your siding repair guy that says, hey, we have XYZ remaining useful life years on this item. Absolutely, those can be included as part of the revisions because you have something in writing from a professional. The reserve studies I mentioned before, it is a budget model, so some variance is okay. We do every once in a while get boards that are wrapped up on the fact that the beauty bark cost was off by $50 when we're talking about $1 million worth of assets. And we know that it's just not going to be exact, just like your annual budget isn't exact. You budget $5,000 for water and you spend $6,000 or you spend $4,000. It's just a budget tool. But of course, we are trying to get it as close as possible. As the projects near, when you look at the remaining useful life of the items in the study, and items that have a remaining useful life of anywhere from 0 to the next 5 years, start researching those as they get close, because you'll need that to both determine the exact timing and the cost. You want to make sure that there's not going to be any surprises, that the reserve study isn't estimating those costs at too low. And then you just want to make sure that the item actually does need to be replaced. Because the reserve study is a budget tool, it's totally possible that it shows that an item is due for replacement, but upon further investigation by an expert in that material or that area, it has another 5 or 10 years left, and then that's what you would report to your provider through the revision period. A building envelope investigation will help the association determine that, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But you can research projects by using vendors that you're interested in working with. You can use a building envelope investigation or any other professional inspections, whether that's a structural investigation. If you have an elevator in your building, having an elevator consultant come out, any professional that can help you research those projects are excellent tools to have in your toolbox. If your association is underfunded, you're going to want to identify and prioritize the essential versus the discretionary projects. Discretionary meaning something like carpet replacement that might be more cosmetic than anything. So here's how you might need or be able to prioritize your reserve study projects. So anything that is risking damage or is a safety concern is going to be priority number 1. So anything structural, of course, siding, roofs, sealant, paint, and deck coatings, those are all helping keep water out of the buildings. So those are always going to be a priority. Once we get water intrusion, we can get hidden damages and even bigger problems. So those are a priority number 1 as well. Anything that's safety related. So trip hazard, if you have a trip hazard at a sidewalk or in your parking lot, and then a fire alarm or fire sprinkler system equipment. Priority number 2 is something that isn't a priority 1, but it does risk accelerated deterioration if you fail to maintain that component, or it could result in equipment failure. So fence staining or asphalt seal coat, both of those help preserve the remaining useful life of that item to make it last as long as possible. But certainly it is not as important as a priority one, which would be keeping water out of a building. Roof cleaning and gutter cleaning are also important because failure to do those can result in bigger problems. Non-hazard concrete repairs, especially if you're in the Bend area, we get those freeze-thaw cycles in the winter. And so even a hairline crack in concrete can turn into a trip hazard. So typically addressing that early will help mitigate the cost of the repair because the repair won't be as big. And then mechanical equipment. The older the equipment is, the higher the risk that that equipment can fail without warning. Priority three are cosmetic things. So carpet, pressure washing things, interior paint, just general decor if you have a clubhouse, furniture, things like that. But it's important to keep in mind that something that might be priority three, like cosmetic, carpet, for example, or any other flooring, it may actually end up being a high priority if it isn't addressed eventually. So we have seen carpet that has either worn to the point that it's become a trip hazard, or it's stretched to where it's got the lumps in it when you walk on it, which becomes a trip hazard. So at that point, it's no longer cosmetic, and now it becomes a priority one because it needs to be replaced in order to maintain safety. So sometimes things can move around in between these three priorities. So I did mention the building envelope investigation, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. So what a building envelope investigation is this is where an architect or an engineer comes out to your building. They typically bring a general contractor with them, and they will take apart key areas of the building where there is a high risk of water damage. So typically that's around windows, where decks connect into the buildings, at roof to wall interfaces and things like that. So these investigations can be pricey. We see them range anywhere from about $5,000 up to $20,000 or more if it's a major, huge building. The $20,000 is a little more atypical. But they will help the association save money over time because they will identify problems early. They will help identify whether the building was properly constructed with appropriate flashings. Is there a proper building paper or barrier behind the siding? They help you identify that now. So if you don't have it or it needs to be repaired, you can either do spot repairs or targeted repairs to address that item. Or in very unfortunate cases, luckily it's somewhat rare, but it does occur, you can replace the entire thing early, which is unfortunate, but it will save money in the long run because you're not having the potential for hidden damages, maybe even some structural issues because of water intrusion into the building. So that's what these building envelope investigations really help with. They're typically done at about 5 to 10-year intervals. And even if they don't find anything that needs to be addressed, they will help the association narrow down the timing in the reserve study. So if they find lots of things, maybe we shorten the remaining useful life of something. And if they find that everything's functioning as needed, then we can either extend the remaining useful life or just leave it as is, depending on what the reserve study currently says. So it is an expense up front, but typically we see it actually saving money in the long run because you have a better idea of what is going on with your building. Here's another one that I think is cute. This affordable home has rustic architecture. And as you can see, they aren't wasting the HOA dues on funding reserves. And boy, do they have some problems. They've got windows boarded open, broken glass. Looks like there's a big old hole in the roof. And the real estate agent is standing there with a couple of buyers who are not looking so thrilled about this. So let's talk about that, and then I'll wrap things up and take questions. So let's talk about who uses the reserve study. So of course, board members do, right? Boards should be reviewing the reserve study and getting back to the reserve provider with any revisions that might need to be done. And so, of course, as part of that project, the managers typically will also look at the reserve study. Oftentimes, the manager is the go-between between the board and the reserve study provider in getting in revisions that need to be done completed. But then owners also look at the reserve study. This is a document that belongs to the association. It's a record of the association, and owners also have the opportunity to view it. And then potential buyers will often look at the reserve study because they're trying to assess their risk of a special assessment if they were to buy a home or a unit within that association. So that cartoon is very fitting here because those buyers are obviously looking at buying into an association that probably is a high risk to them if that association is not properly funding reserves. The two new areas that we are really seeing pressure from in the market is from lenders, both on the association side and the buyer side. So what I mean there is if your association is underfunded and you need to do a project, there are banks out there that will lend specifically to community associations so you can do your reserve project. But as part of that lending process, they will review the reserve study. And they will often ask for what is called a post-construction reserve study, which is a reserve study that shows the project that you are taking the loan for has been completed, so that the association knows what its reserve position going forward looks like. Because what that bank does not want is to lend you, the association, a bunch of money and then have you realize in 2 more years you need another loan because you don't have enough money for the next project. So we often see lenders looking at reserve studies because they want to make sure that the project that you are doing or the loan you are taking is enough to complete the project. We've actually seen some associations that add projects to their loans to do more than one item in order to prevent being underfunded for the next item. So lenders from the association side pay quite a bit of attention to the reserve study. But where we're also seeing it are buyer lenders. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who underwrite the majority of loans in the country, they also scrutinize the reserve study and in some cases are refusing to lend in communities that are grossly underfunded or are not funding reserves in accordance with the lender's guidelines. So what that means is a buyer may not be able to get the loan they need to buy the unit, which can affect the seller trying to sell their unit. So that's something that's been a little bit new in the last few years, but we are seeing it occur. And then lastly, some of your communities may have run into this already. Insurance is a very big thing right now. Premiums are going through the roof. Lenders are really trying to avoid communities which are at high risk of a claim. So their underwriting departments are looking at reserve studies. And in kind of my discussion with insurance agents that are in the industry, it's my understanding that the concern is that a poorly funded association may be at higher risk of a claim because they don't have enough money to properly maintain their property. So we are seeing underwriters review the reserve study as part of that process. And it could affect either an association's ability to get insurance or it could affect the premium that they pay for that insurance. So the lending and the insurance underwriters are two kind of new things, but they're turning out to be pretty frequent. So just something to think about when your association is deciding how well to fund its reserve account. So that is the end of the presentation. I know that was probably a lot of material that I zipped through there, but I am happy to take any questions that might have come up.
So if you have questions, go ahead and either type them into the chat if you can't unmute yourself, or if you want to go ahead and unmute, you guys are welcome to go ahead and unmute at this point and ask anything that you might have.
This is Bob Tiernan, and I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First off, can we get a copies of your slides that you presented here? Could you email them to us?
I'm happy to share the slides. I'll defer to Aperion on how they distribute those, but I'm happy to send that over. Absolutely.
That would help lousy note taking.
We also this is actually being recorded and we're going to upload it onto our YouTube channel. And anybody that's on here, we're going to send you guys a link directly to that as well. So you can listen to and go back through the entire presentation if you wanted to.
Okay, I got a couple more questions. I'll just rapid fire. Are fireplaces typically included in reserve studies?
What part of the fireplace?
The entire fireplace, the fireplace from the chimney all the way up to the top?
So no, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So typically the reserve study would fund for chimney caps because those do have a predictable useful life. The fireplace itself generally does not have a predictable useful life. And typically when they're in the unit, they're an owner responsibility. But if your governing documents made it an association responsibility, and the association has either a history or some sort of indicator that they do have a predictable useful life, your reserve study provider absolutely can include any item that your community specifically needs funded for. But the short answer is it would not typically be included just generally.
How about ducting underneath the building? So the ducting that would carry the air conditioning or the heat.
Same thing. That does not have a predictable useful life. There's no industry standard that says you replace your ductwork every 30 years, like you replace a roof. There's just no known replacement cycle for those that we see over and over and over at buildings. But again, anytime an association has concerns or maybe has a history of things, then that would be a component that would be added for that association specifically to their reserve study. But it would not just be automatically included in every reserve study by a provider.
Since I get the hint that you're from the Bend area, you're familiar that it's the high desert, and certain items in high desert climate have a much longer life than it would be a climate where I'm at in Lake Oswego, which is a very wet, damp climate. Does reserve studies take into impact two different things? One is the climate of the area, and secondly, the quality of the product. For instance, if we used 100% clear vertical cedar siding, which would be very unusual for any place in the Lake Oswego area to have, even though it's a high-end area, you do find that down in the Bend area. So when we're looking at siding and evaluating, do you take into consideration the quality of the material that was originally put on the building?
Yes. So we actually are located in Central Washington is where our firm is out of, but we do quite a bit of work in the Bend area. But we also cover the entire state of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. So we see multiple climates. So again, the reserve study does adjust for the location of the client. We also adjust the costs of things for client-specific items, for location-specific items. So the reserve study is not a one-size-fits-all. It shouldn't be. I'm sure there's maybe providers out there that do that, but it really should be adjusted for the client specifically. And that's where those site visits are so important for us to get boots on the ground and see how things are at that exact client. There's no just wide-scale boilerplate.
Okay. Last question. When you have expenditures coming out of the reserve, is it a standard to have 2 or 3 bids before you go forward with awarding those contracts for spending dollars that are coming out of the reserve study?
It depends on the project. We do typically see 3 bids on average. For the major projects, so windows, roof, siding, if you're using a professional project manager, they will advise the number of bids. They'll also give you recommendations for firms for which to bid on that, and they will obtain those and provide those for you. But for a project that the association may be proceeding on its own with, let's say, just asphalt work, you typically wouldn't use a consultant for that. We typically see 3 bids, unless it's a very small project, then it would be up to the association's discretion as to how many vendors they wish to get bids from.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I put a question in the chat, and really my question is, when we have these reserves, they're sitting in an account. In my mind, that's terrible because it's not, inflation is 4% a year on it, 3 to 4% a year on average. So we're losing that value every year that's just sitting there. Do you make recommendations for conservative investments so that we're not like hemorrhaging the value of the money that's sitting in these accounts, and how is that handled?
That's a very good question. So the reserve study provider does not do that. That's outside their scope. However, there are banks out there that can help the association with that. There's banks that specialize in community associations only. And they will actually look at your reserve study, help you figure out when you're going to need funds available. So for example, if you're going to do CDs to get a better interest rate, they'll help you ladder those so that you don't have all your money locked up when you need it for roof replacement, to help you maximize the return on your investment. So there are partners in the industry that do that, but your reserve study provider would not typically provide that service.
Is there like recommendations, or do you have like a list that we could like review if that's something that we want to look at?
I would defer you back to Aperion. They would have partners that they've probably worked with in the past. If they don't, then I could certainly poke around and see what other clients have used.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely.
Karen, this is Sharon. Do you typically recommend when neighborhoods have different characteristics by the age of the area that was developed, that they have separate reserve studies? As an example, we have 150 of our homes have no sidewalks or curb and gutter, and the other 100 do. And so would you separate those so that curb and gutter, and that would be a separate reserve study than the rest of the neighborhood, the other part of the neighborhood?
That is a fabulous question. So we only do that if your governing documents provide for it. If your governing documents do not specifically provide for the association to bill only certain costs to certain owners, then you would have one reserve study for everybody. And unfortunately, those people that don't have sidewalks would be paying for sidewalks. We do see governing documents that split that out. A fabulous example would be communities that have private alleys. Oftentimes, the homes that are on the private alleys are responsible for that alley asphalt, and the other homes do not pay for it. In those cases, we do a separate reserve study so that the cost of that alley is allocated to those homes only. But your governing documents have to provide for it. It's not something that's optional at the association's discretion.
And is that at a sub-association level or at the major association level, or can it be both?
It could be both.
Okay.
If you have a master association and then you have a sub-association, it could be either one. But it would be whichever of the entities the reserve study is being prepared for. So if it's being prepared for a master association, it would have to be in the master association documents. Or if you're a sub-association within a master, then the reserve study for the sub would have to match the sub documents. We can't cross them. So your governing documents, typically when we see that, associations are already aware of it because your monthly, annual, however you bill your assessments, are already billed to different groups. So we would catch that as part of the reserve study process and split it out, but the governing documents have to provide for it.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Anything else I can answer for you?
Oh, so how do we get copies of these slides? You get to send them to Asperian, or how do we get our hands on them?
I will send them to Aperion and I'll leave it up to them however they choose to distribute things. I don't have a distribution list for the attendees today.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Bob, if you, I'm sorry, which community are you in?
I'm with the Sun River Lodges.
Okay, so if you want to reach out to your community manager and just let them know that you are in here, they can reach out to me and I will get them the copy of the slides once I get those.
Okay, that's Eric runs our meetings.
Aaron does?
Eric?
Oh, Eric, that's right. Okay, I'll make sure Eric gets it over to you then.
Sounds great.
Can I
Perfect.
also get it at Mount Bachelor Village?
Yes, and you have Gary, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for
All right,
having
thanks,
me.
Karen. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, Karen.